Hello, my friends. Indiana Holmes here again tonight as we continue our book, A Silent Witness. We begin tonight with Chapter 5, The Lethal Chamber. A young man and newly qualified doctor emerging for the first time into private practice is apt to be somewhat surprised and disconcerted by the new conditions, accustomed to the exclusively professional and scientific atmosphere of the hospital. The sudden appearance of the personal element as the predominant factor rather takes him aback. He finds himself a new and unexpected position, no longer a mere impersonal official, a portion of a great machine. He is the paid servant of his patients, who are not always above letting him feel the conditions of his service. The hospital patient, drilled into a certain respectful submissiveness by the discipline of the wards, has given place to an employer, usually critical, sometimes truculent, and occasionally addicted to a disagreeable frankness of speech. The locum tenens, moreover, is peculiarly susceptible to these conditions, especially if, as in my case, his appearance is youthful. Patients resent the substitution of a stranger for the familiar medical attendant and are at no great pains to disguise the fact. The old woman with the liver, to adopt Batson's peculiar phrase, or peculicid phrase, hinted that I was rather young, adding encouragingly that I should be, or I should get, the better of that in time, while the more morose typhoid bluntly informed me that he hadn't bargained for being attended by a medical student. Taken as a whole, I found the private practice disappointing as soon as I began to wish myself back in the wards and to sigh for my quiet, solitary rambles on Hampstead Heath. Still, there were rifts in the cloud. Some of the patients appreciated the interest that I took in their cases, evidently contrasting it with the rather casual attitude of my principal, and some more positively friendly. But in generally, my reception was less as to make me slightly apprehensive whenever a new patient appeared. On the fourth evening after Batson's departure, Mrs. Samway was announced, and I prepared myself for the customary snub. But I was mistaken. Nothing could be more gracious than her manner towards me, though the object of her visit occasioned me some embarrassment. "I have called, Dr. Jardine," she said, "to ask you if you could let me have the account for my poor Mr. Maddock. My husband is the executor, you know, and as we shall be going back to Paris quite shortly, he wants to get everything settled up." I was in a rather quandary. Of the financial side of the practice, I was absolutely ignorant, and I thought it best to say no, but I added, "Dr. Batson will be back on Friday evening if you can wait so long." "Oh, that will do quite well," she replied, "but don't forget to tell him that we want the account at once." I promised not to forget, and then remarked that she would no doubt be glad to get back to Paris. "No," she answered, "I shall be rather sorry. Of course, Camden Town is not a very attractive neighborhood, but it is close to the heart of London, and then there are some delightful places near and quite accessible. There is Highgate, for instance." "Yes, but it is getting very much built over, isn't it?" "Unfortunately it is, but yet there are some very pleasant places left. The old village is still charming, so quaint and old world, and then there is Hampstead. What could be more delightful than the Heath? But perhaps you don't know Hampstead." "Oh, yes, I do," said I. "My rooms are at Gospel Oak, quite near the Heath, and I think I know every nook and corner of the neighborhood. I am pining for a stroll on the Heath at this very moment." "I dare say you are," she said sympathetically. "This is a depressing neighborhood if you can't get away from it. We found it very dismal at first after Paris. Do you live in Paris? I asked. Not permanently, she replied, but we spend a good deal of time there. My husband is a dealer of works in art, so he has to travel about a good deal. That is how we came to know Mr. Maddock. He was a dealer too, wasn't he? I inquired. Yes, in a way. He had a means of his own, and his dealing was a mere excuse for collecting things that he wanted and was not going to keep. He had a passion for buying, and then he used to sell the things in order to buy more. But I am afraid I am detaining you with my chatter. No, not at all, I said, eagerly, only to be glad to have an intelligent, educated person to talk to. You are the last caller, and I hope I have finished my day's work. Accordingly, she stayed quite a long time, chatting on a variety of subjects, and finally on that of cremation. I dare say, she said, it is more sanitary and wholesome than burial, but there is always something rather dreadful about it. Perhaps it is because we are not accustomed to the idea. Did you go to the funeral? I asked. Yes, Mr. Maddock had no friends in England, but my husband and me. We both went. It was very solemn and awesome. The coffin was laid at the catafalque while a short service was read, and then 2 metal doors opened, and it was passed through it out of our sight. We waited some time, and was presently they brought us a little terracotta urn with just a handful or two of white ash in it. That was all that was left of our poor friend Septimus Maddock. Don't you think it is rather dreadful? Death is always rather dreadful, I answered. But when we look at the ashes of a dead person, we realize the total destruction of the body, whereas the grave keeps its secrets. If we could look down through the earth and see the changes that are taking place, we should probably find the slow decay more shocking than the swift consumption by fire. Fortunately, we cannot, but we know the final result is the same in both. Mrs. Samwaite shuddered slightly and drew her wraps more closely about her. Yes, she said with a faint sigh, the same end awaits us all, but it is better not to think about it. We were all both silent for a while. I sat with my gaze bent rather absently on the case book before me, turning over her last somewhat gloomy utterance, until, chancing to look up, I found her pale, penetrating eyes fixed on me with the same strange intentness that I had noticed when she had looked at me as I sat by the body of Maddock. As she met my glance, she looked downward quickly, without confusion, and with a return to her habitual reposefulness. Half unconsciously, I returned her scrutiny. She was a remarkable-looking woman, a beautiful woman, too, but of that type that is, in our time and country, rare, an ancient or barbaric type, which is womanly beauty and grace, and joined to manifest physical strength. I felt that some unusual racial mixture spoke in her inconsistent coloring, her clear pink skin, her pale eyes, and jet black hair that rippled down either side of her low forehead in little crimpy waves as regular and formal as the archaic curls of the early Greek sculptures. But predominant over all other qualities was that of strength, full and plump, soft and almost ultra-feminine, lithesome and flexible in every pose and movement. Yet, to me, the chief impression that her appearance suggested was strength, sheer, muscular strength, not the rigid bulldog strength of a strong man, but the soft, supple strength of a leopard. I looked at her as she sat almost limply in her chair, with her head upon one side, her hands resting in her lap, and a beautiful, soft, womanly droop of the shoulders that I felt she could have started up in an instant, active and strong, formidable, like a roused panther. I was going on, I think, to make comparisons between her and that of that other woman who was wont to trip so daintily down Mulfield Lane. When she raised her eyes, She raised her eyes slowly to mine and suddenly blushed scarlet. Am I a very remarkable looking person, Dr. Jardine? She asked quietly, as if answering my thoughts. The rebuke was well merited, for in an instant a paltry compliment fluttered on my lips, but I swallowed it down. She wasn't that kind of woman. I am afraid I have been staring at you and your countenance, Mrs. Samway, I said apologetically. Hardly that, she replied with a smile, but you certainly were looking at me very attentively. Well, I said, recovering myself, after all, a cat may look at a king, you know. She laughed softly, a very pretty, musical laugh, and rose, still blushing warmly. And so, she retorted, by the same reasoning, you think a king may look at a cat? Very well, Dr. Jardine. Good night. She held out her hand, a beautifully shaped hand, though rather large, but, as I have said, she was not a small woman, and as it clasped mine, though the pressure was quite gentle, it conveyed, like her appearance, an impression of abundant physical strength. I accompanied her to the door and watched her as she walked up the dingy street with an easy, erect, undulating gait, even as might have walked those women who are portrayed for the wonder of all time on the ivory-toned marble of the Parthenon frieze. I followed with my eyes the dignified, graceful figure until it vanished round the corner, and then went back to the consulting room, dimly wondering why a woman of such manifest beauty and charm should offer so little attraction to me. Batson's practice, among its other drawbacks, suffered from a deadly lack of professional interest. Whether this was its normal condition or whether his patients had got wind of me and called in other and more experienced practitioners, I know not. But certainly, after the stirring of work at the hospital, the cases that I had to deal with seemed very small, like a small beer. Hence, the prospect of a genuine surgical case came as a grateful surprise, and I hailed it with enthusiasm. It was on the day before Batson's expected return that I received a summons, which was delivered to me in a dirty envelope as I sat by the bedside of the last patient on my list. If the messenger waiting, or is the messenger waiting? I asked, tearing open the envelope. No, doctor. He just handed in the note and went off. He seemed to be in a hurry. I ran my eye over the message, scrawled in a rather illiterate hand on a sheet of common notepaper, and read, Sir, will you please come at once to the Mineral Water Works in Norton Street? One of our men has injured himself rather badly. Yours truly, J. Parker. P.S. He is bleeding a good deal, so please come quick. The postscript gave a very quick and a very necessary piece of information. An injury which bled would require certain dressings and surgical appliances, over which, above those contained in my pocket case, and to obtain these I should have to take Bastion's house on the way. Slipping the note into my pocket, I wished my patient a hasty adieu and strode off at a swinging pace in the direction of Jacob Street. The household maid, Maggie, helped me to find the dressing and pack the bag, for she was a handy, intelligent girl, though no beauty, and meanwhile I questioned her as to the whereabouts of Norton Street and the mineral water factory. Oh, I know the place well enough, sir, said she, though I didn't know the works were open. Norton Street is only a few minutes' walk from here. It's quite close to Gayton Street, and in fact, works are just at the back of Samway's house. You got up the corner by Market and take the second, and then the right, and then... Look here, Maggie, I interrupted. You'd better come and show me the way, as you know the place. There's no time to waste on fumbling for the right turning. Very well, sir, she replied, and the bag now being packed with all the necessary instruments and dressings, we set forth together. Is this a large factory? I asked, as she trotted by my side, to the astonished admiration of Jacob Street, and the neighborhood in general. No, sir, she replied. It's quite a small place. The last people went bankrupt, and the works were empty and to let for a long time. I thought they were still to let, but I suppose somebody has taken them and started a business afresh. It's around here. She piloted me around a corner into a narrow by-street, near the end by which she halted at the gate of a yard of mews. Above the entrance was a weather-beaten board bearing the inscription International Mineral Water Company and a half-defaced printed bill offering the premises to let, and at the side a large bell pull. A vigorous tug on the ladder set the bell jangling within, and as Maggie tripped away at the street, a small wicket in the gate opened, disclosing the dimly seen figure of a man standing in the inner darkness. "Are you the doctor?" he inquired. I answered yes, and being thereupon bidden to enter, stepped through the opening of the wicket, which the man immediately closed, shutting out the last gleam of light from the street and the street lamp outside. "It's rather dark," said the unseen custodian, taking me by the arm. "It is indeed," I replied, groping with my feet over the rough cobbles. "Hadn't you better get a light of some kind?" "I will in a minute," was the reply. "You see, all the other men have gone home. We close at 6 sharp. This is the way. I'll strike a match. The man is down in the bottling room." My conductor struck a match by the light of which he guided me through the doorway, along the passage or corridor, and down a flight of stone steps. At the bottom of the steps was a flagged passage, out from which opened what looked like a range of cellars. Along the passage I walked warily, followed by the stranger, and lighted, very imperfectly, by the matches that he struck, the glimmer of which threw a gigantic and ghostly shadow of myself on the stone floor, but failed utterly to pierce the darkness ahead. I was exactly opposite the yawning doorway of one of the cellars when the match went out, and the man behind me exclaimed, "Wait a moment, doctor. Don't move until I strike another light." I halted abruptly. The next moment I received a violent thrust that had sent me staggering through the open doorway into the cellar. Instantly the massive door slammed, and a pair of heavy bolts were shot in succession on the outside. "What the devil is the meaning of this?" I roared, battering and kicking furiously at the door. Of course there was no answer, and I quickly stopped my demonstrations, for it dawned on me in a moment that the factory was unattended, save the ruffian who had admitted me, that I had been decoyed here of a set purpose, though what purpose was I could not imagine. But it was not long before I received a pretty broad hint as to the immediate intentions of my host. A gentle thumping at the door of the cellar attracted my attention and caused me to lay my ear against the wood. The sound that I heard was quite unmistakable. The crevices of the door were being filled apparently with pieces of rag, which my friend was ramming home, presumably with a chisel. In fact, the door was being caulked to make the joints airtight. The object of this proceeding was clear enough. I was shut up in an airtight cavity in which I was to be slowly suffocated. That was quite obvious. Why was I to be suffocated? I had no form, no sort of guess, excepting that I had fallen into the hands of a homicidal lunatic. But I was not greatly alarmed. The air in the good-sized cellar will last a considerable time, and I could easily poke about and poke out anything that my friend might have stuffed into the keyhole. Then, when the men arrived in the morning, I would kick out the cellar door, and they would come and let me out. There was nothing to be particularly frightened about. But stay, were there any men? The injured man was evidently a myth. Supposing the other men were a myth too. I recalled Maggie's remark that she had thought the place was still to let. That is, it was probably still for rent. Perhaps it was. That would be rather more serious. At this point, my cogitations were broken in upon by sounds from the adjoining cellar. the sound of someone moving about and dragging some heavy body, and it struck me at once as strange that I should hear these sounds so distinctly, seeing the massive door of my own cellar was closed, sealed, and the walls were of solid brick, as I ascertained by rapping at them with my knuckles. But I had no time to consider the circumstance, for there suddenly arose a new sound, whereat I must confess my heart faintly came into my mouth, a loud, penetrating hiss, like the shriek of an escaping stream. It seemed to come from some part of the cellar in which I was immured, from a spot nearly overhead, and it was immediately echoed by a similar sound in the adjoining cellar, and then a third. Even at last, sound broke forth. The door of the adjoining cellar slammed. The bolts were shot, and then faintly mingled with a discordant hissing, I could hear the dull thumping that told me that the cracks of the door, too, were being caulked. It was a frightful situation. The hissing sound was obviously caused by the escape of some gas under high pressure, and that gas must be entering my cellar through some opening. I felt it, my matchbox, and groping along the wall towards the point whence the loudest sound, and indeed all the sounds, proceeded, I struck a match. The glimmer of the wax vesta made everything clear. Close to the ceiling, about 7 feet from the ground, was an opening in the wall about 6 inches square, and pouring through this a continuous stream, a cloud of white particles that glistened like snowflakes. As I stood under the opening, some of them settled on my face, and more than icy coldness of contact told the whole horrible tale in a moment. This white powder was snow, carbonic acid snow. The hissing sound came from 3 of these great iron bottles, charged under pressure with liquefied carbonic acid, which are used by mineral water manufacturers for aerating the water. The miscreant or lunatic who had imprisoned me had turned on the taps, and the liquid was escaping and congealing into the snow with a cold produced by its rapid evaporation of expansion. The course of the snow would quickly absorb heat and, without again liquefying, evaporate into gaseous form. In a very short time, both cellars would be full of the poisonous gas, and in a word, I was shut up in a lethal chamber. It has taken me some time to write this explanation, which, however, flashed through my brain in the twinkling of an eye as the light of the match fell on that sinister cloud of snowflakes. In a moment I had my coat off and was stuffing it for dear life into the opening. It was but a poor protection against the gas, which would easily enough find its way through the interstices of the fabric, but it would stop the direct stream of the snow and give me time to think. On what incalculable chances do the great issues of our lives depend? If I had been a short man, I must have been dead in a half hour, for the opening through which the cloud of snow was pouring was well over 7 feet above the floor, and would have been quite out of my reach, even as it had been with my 6 feet stature and corresponding length of arm. It was impossible to ram my coat into the opening with the necessary force, for I had to stand close to the wall with my arm upraised at great mechanical disadvantage. Still, as I have said, imperfect as the obstruction was, it served to stop the inrushing cloud of snow. It would take some time for the heavy gas in the adjoining cellar to rise to the level of the opening, and meanwhile I could be devising other measures. I lit another match and looked about me. The cellar was much smaller than I had thought, and was absolutely empty. The floor was of concrete. the walls of rough brickwork, and the ceiling of plaster, all cracked and falling in. There was plenty of ventilation there, but that was of no interest to me. Carbonic acid gas is so heavy that it behaves almost like liquid, and it would have filled the cellar and suffocated me even if the top of my prison had been open to the sky. The adjoining cellar was already filling rapidly, and when the gas in it reached the level of the opening, it would percolate through my coat and come pouring down into my cellar. But that, as I have said, would take some time if the dividing wall was moderately sound. This important qualification, as soon as it occurred to me, set me exploring the wall with the aid of another match, and very unsatisfactorily was the result. It was a bad wall, built of inferior brick and worse mortar, and was marked by innumerable holes, where the wall hooks and other fastenings had been driven in between the bricks. My brief survey convinced me that so far as being gas-tight, the wall was as pervious as a sponge, and that whatever I meant to do to preserve my life, I must set about without delay. But what was I to do? That was the urgent and vital question. Escape was evidently impossible. There were no means of stopping it, of stopping up numberless holes and weak places in the wall. The only vulnerable spot was the door. If I could establish some communication with the outer air, I could, for a time at least, disregard the poisonous gas with which I should presently be surrounded. The first thing to be considered was the keyhole. That must be unstopped at once. Fumbling in my bag, for I had grown of a sudden disregard with the matches, I found a good-sized probe, which I insinuated into the keyhole, and in a moment my hopes in that direction were extinguished, for the end of the probe impinged upon metal. The keyhole was not stopped with a rag, but with a plate of metal fixed on the outside, with rapidly growing alarm, but with a tidiness born of habit. I put the probe back in the bag and began feverishly to review the situation and consider my resources. And then I had an idea, only a poor forlorn hope, but still an idea. There is a certain ingenious type of pocket knife, devised principally in the interest of the cutlery trade, that innocent persons, usually of the female persuasion, are wont to bestow as presents on their masculine friends. Such a knife I chanced to possess. It had been given to me by an aunt, and sentimental considerations had induced me to give it an amount of room in my trousers, a pocket that continually grudged. However, there it was at this critical moment, with its corkscrew, gimlet, its bewildering array of blades, its hoof pick, toothpick, tweezers, file, screwdriver, assorted unclassifiable tools, a preponderance, a lump of pocket-destroying uselessness, and yet the appointed means of saving my life. The gimlet was the first tool that I called into requisition. Very gingerly, for these tools are commonly over-tempered and brittle, I bored in the thick plank a hole at about the level of my mouth, and as I worked, I turned over my further plans. When the gimlet was through the door, I selected a tool on whose use I had often speculated, a sharp-edged spike, like a diminutive and very stumpy bayonet, which I proceeded to use broach-wise to enlarge the hole. When this tool worked loose, I exchanged it for the screwdriver, with which I managed to broach the hole out to about half an inch width, and with this as large as I could make it, and it was not large enough. True, one could breathe fairly comfortably through a half-inch hole, but with the deadly gas circulating around, a freer opening was very desirable. Then I bethought me the magic knife contained a saw, a wretched, thick-bladed affair, but still saw, which would actually cut wood if you gave it time. This implement suggested a simple plan, which I forthwith put into execution, working as rapidly as I could without running the risk of breaking the tools. My plan was to make a second hole, some 2 inches diagonally below the first, and from each hole to carry 2 saw cuts at right angles to one another. The 2 pairs of cuts would intersect and make a square piece out of the door, giving me a little bit of window through which I could breathe in comfort. It was a trifling task, but yet, with the miserable tools I had, it took considerable time to execute, the more since the saw blade was wider than the holes, excepting at this point. However, it was accomplished at last, and I had the satisfaction of pushing out the little separated square of wood and feeling that I now had free access to the pure air outside my dungeon. But it was none too soon. As I rested from my labors, it occurred to me to test the condition of the air inside. Lighting a match, I held a little taper so that the flame ascended steadily and then lowered it slowly. As it descended, the flame changed color somewhat. About 18 inches from the floor, it went out suddenly. There was, then, a layer of pure gas, about 18 inches deep, covering the floor, and no doubt rising pretty rapidly. This was rather startling, and it warned me to have recourse, without delay, to my breathing hole. For though carbonic acid gas behaves somewhat as a liquid, it is not liquid. Like other gases, it has the power of diffusing upwards, and the air of the cellar must be already getting unsafe. Accordingly, after carefully wiping the surface of the door with my handkerchief, I applied my mouth with some distaste to the opening and took in a deep draught of undoubtedly pure air. The position in which I had to stand with my mouth to the hole was an irksome one, and I foresaw that it would presently become very fatiguing. Moreover, when the gas reached the level of my head, it would be difficult to prevent some of it from finding its way into my mouth and nostrils, and if it did, I should most assuredly be poisoned. This consideration suggested the necessity of making another hole at a lower level to let out the gas and allow me to rest myself by a change of position. But this new task had to be carried out with my mouth glued to the breathing hole, and very awkward and tiring I found it, and very slow was the progress that I made. This second hole was smaller than the first, for time was precious, and I reflected that I could easily enlarge it by fresh saw cuts, each 2 of which would take out a triangular piece of wood. But it was tedious work, and its complication left me with aching arms. Indeed, I was beginning to ache all over from the constrained position. Taking a deep breath and shutting my mouth, I stood up and stretched myself. Then I lit a match and looked at my watch, 8:30. I had been over 2 hours in the cellar, and meanwhile the patients were waiting for me at surgery, and no doubt murmuring at the delay. How soon would my absence lead to inquiries? Or were inquiries being made even now? Looking at the match, that I still held in my hand, I noticed that the flame was pallid and bluish, and as I lowered it slowly, it went out. It was even over 2 feet from the floor now. The gas then was still rising quickly, though not so rapidly as I had feared. But from the altered color of the flame, it was evident that the air of the cellar generally contained enough diffused gas to be actively poisonous. After a time, the erect position began to grow insupportably fatiguing. I felt that I must sit down for a few minutes, rest, even though prudence whispered that it was highly unsafe. I struggled for a while, but eventually, conquered by fatigue, sat down on the floor with my mouth applied closely to the lower hole, breathing in air from the outside. I persuaded myself that I would sit only long enough to recover some of my strength, but a minute after minute sped by, still felt an uncomfortable reluctance to rise. Suddenly, I became conscious of a vague feeling of drowsiness, of a desire to lean back against the wall and doze. It was only slight, but its significance was so appalling that I scrambled to my feet in a panic, and putting my mouth to the upper breathing hole, took several deep aspirations and inspirations. But I soon realized that the upright position was impossible. The drowsy feeling continued, and there was growing with it a lassitude and weakness of the limbs that threatened to leave me only the choice between sitting or falling. A wave of furious anger swept over me and roused me a little, a burst of hatred of the cowardly wretch who had decoyed me, as I now suspected, to my death. Then this feeling passed and was succeeded by chilly fear, and I sank down once more into a seating position, with my mouth pressed to the lower hole. The time ran unchecked by me. Gradually, imperceptible degrees, my mental state grew more and yet more sluggish. Anger and fear and ever-dwindling hope flitted by, turns across the slowly fading field of my consciousness. Intervals of quiet indifference, almost of placid comfort, began to intervene, with increasing latitude and a growing desire for rest. To lie down, that was what I wanted, to lay my head upon the stony floor and sink into sweet oblivion. At last I must have actually dozed, though fortunately without removing my mouth from the breathing hole, for I had no sense of the passage of time, when I was suddenly aroused by the loud and continuous jangling of a bell. I listened with a sort of dull eagerness, and keeping awake with a conscious effort, the bell pealed wildly and without pause for what seemed to me quite a long time. Then it ceased, and again my consciousness began to grow dim. After an interval, I know not how long, there came to me dimly, and only half perceived, the closing of a door, the patter of quick footsteps, and then the voice of a man calling me by name. I struggled to get onto my feet, but could not move. But I still held the clasp knife, and was able to rap with it feebly on the door. Again I heard the voice. It sounded nearer now, and yet infinitely far away. And again I rapped the door and shouted through the breathing hole, a thin muffled cry, such as one utters in a troubled dream. And then the drowsiness crept over me again, and I heard no more. The next thing of which I was conscious was a sounding thwack on the cheeks with some wet that felt like a dead fish. I opened my eyes, and I looked vaguely into 2 faces that were close to mine and seemed to be lighted by a lamp or a candle. The faces were somehow familiar, but yet I failed clearly to recognize them. After staring stupidly for a few moments, I began to doze again. Then the dead fish returned to assault me. Again I opened my eyes. Another vigorous flop caused me again to open my mouth with an unparliamentary gasp. "Ah, that's better," said the familiar, yet unplaced voice, when a man is able to swear he is fairly on the road to recovery. Flop. The renewed attentions of the dead fish, which turned out later to be merely a wet towel, evoked further demonstrations on my part of progressing recovery, accompanied by a nervous titter in a female voice. Gradually, the clouds rolled away, and my returning consciousness, the faces revealed themselves as those of Maggie, the housemaid, and Dr. Thorndyke. Even to my muddled wits, the presence of the latter was somewhat of a puzzle, and in the intervals of the amazing deceased fish, or so I thought, which I had yet to identify, I found myself hazily speculating on the problem of how my revered teacher came to be in this place, and what place this was. "Come now, Jardine," said Dr. Thorndyke, emptying a jug of water on my face, and receiving a volley of spluttered expletives in exchange. "Pull yourself together. How did you get in that cellar?" "Hang if I know," said I, composing myself for another nap. But here the wet towel came once more into the requisition, and that with such vigor that, if a fit of exasperation, I sat up and yawned. "I think you'd better fetch a cab," said Thorndyke, as Maggie wrung out the towel afresh. "But leave the gate open when you go out." "What's there a cab for?" I asked sulkily. "Can't I walk?" "If you can, it will be better," said Thorndyke. "Let us see if you are able to stand." He hoisted me on to my feet, and he and Maggie, taking each an arm, walked me slowly up and down the cobbled yard, which I now began to recognize as appertaining to the mineral water works. At first I staggered very drunkenly, but by degrees and drowsy feeling wore off, and was able to walk with Thorndyke's assistance only. "I think we might venture out now," said he, at length piloting me towards the gate, and when I stumbled rather awkwardly through the wicket, we set forth homeward. On my arrival home, Thorndyke ordered me a supply of strong coffee and a light meal, after which, it being obvious that I was good for nothing in a professional sense, he suggested that I should go to bed. "Don't worry about the practice," said he. "I will send for my friend Jervis, and between us we shall see that everything is looked after. If Maggie will give me a sheet of paper and an envelope, I will write a note to him, and then she can take hansom to my chambers and give the note to either Dr. Jervis or my man Polton. Meanwhile, I will stay here and see that you do not go to sleep prematurely." He wrote the note, and Maggie, having made such improvements in her outward garb as befitted the status of a rider in hansoms, took charge of it and departed with much satisfaction and dignity. Thorndyke made a few inquiries of me as to the circumstances that led me to my incarceration in the cellar, but finding that I knew no more than Maggie, whom he had already questioned, he changed the subject, nor would he allow me again to refer to it. "No, Jardine," he said, "better think no more of it for the present. Have a good night's rest, and then, if you are all right in the morning, we will go into the matter and see if we can put the puzzle together." And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 5. Well, that is some very strange things, a strange instance, strange to be brought to an abandoned factory, entombed in some type of a vault or cell, with seemingly another person possibly in another cell, and then to have been found by one's former teacher and then rescued with still no knowledge of why. But I guess we may find out in the next chapter. So with that, I say goodnight to you and see you tomorrow night for chapter 6. This has been Indiana Holmes. Love to you all, and good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.